I thought I'd do one of those Jennifer Lawrence moments and trip on the way up, but I was afraid it wouldn't be quite as graceful as it now. Now, I think that the people that are doing the artwork are having, too much fun, just too much fun. And so, do you want to be a pianist, a poet, or a painter? Pianist, how many is going to be piano players? Yeah. How many are going to be poets? Yes, that's very impressive. And painters. Any painters in the group? I think I want to be all three. Well, instead we're going to talk about cities, and cities are also a piece of art. But there's so many other things that it makes it very difficult for us to do cities well, and they just do well in certain places. How many of you love where you live? So see, now you're not supposed to for this talk. The fact is, you have to have something broken so I can fix it. That's what architects do. I need a problem to solve. Well, so the fact is that there's a lot of things about the city. Traffic is a big problem, blight is a problem, poverty is a problem. Any of you that have ever tried to work out a deal where you live in a walkable neighborhood, that your kids can go to school for public education, and also have a job nearby. Now that is a hard mix to put together, but it can be done. It could be done if cities were made for us instead of the other way around. We make our lives based on what cities are like. There's some really huge, I call them epic, shifts that are underway right now. They're already happening, and I think they're going to change the way that we make cities. The thing is that there's three major fallacies about how we make cities already that we need to be working on. So, first of all, I wanted to just take you back a little bit on my background. When I graduated from architecture school in the 1970s, and of course I was 2 at the time, because of course I couldn't be that old. It sneaks up on you, it really does. At any rate, when I graduated, I had all these huge dreams. When people get out of architecture school, they want to make the world a better place. That's why you go. You're going to make beautiful buildings, and you're going to make places that are green and social, and everybody loves them. But nobody was hiring. The thing is, it was those OPEC cycles or recessions that we started getting these because of the oil crisis. And the first we really saw the energy crisis hitting us on oil, and there was a series of these rolling recessions, they were called at the time. Well, so I heard that they were hiring in Montana, so I left Kansas City, my hometown, and headed up there, and sure enough, got a job in a day. About 3 years later, after a lot of work, a lot of projects, came back to Kansas City, and what do you know, another recession? But I had all this great experience, so I was able to get a job pretty quickly. I had to work at a really large engineering firm. Then I worked at a smaller firm, and then a few years later, another recession hits, and this time I said, okay, enough. If those guys can run a business, so can I. Now that's the kind of thing that you do when you're in your 20s, you just kind of head off and start doing something new. Well, as you might imagine, in the early 80s, there really weren't that many women business owners, and not very many of them at all were architects. In fact, I think it was the only woman architecture firm in this town, in Kansas City at the time. And so it made me a little unusual. In fact, one of the clients, when I went into a job interview in Osceola, Missouri, which is kind of in mid-Missouri, he says, well, you don't even look like an architect. I'm like, what do you think, the Fountainhead, Gary Cooper, or something like that? He says, no, I suppose I don't. But the really good thing about that was, I thought I could make my own rules. If I was so different, then why didn't I just make my own rules? Well, our company did pretty well. I kept it for 20 years plus, and then sold it so that I could do crazy stuff like this. And but we did larger and larger projects, more and more complex projects, to where we were. Here's in fact one that I can show you, which is a urban park that links City Hall and the federal courthouse. And it included a 60-block plan of downtown Kansas City and an 18-block civic center that we invented in the process. And these were really complicated and important projects. And I ended up wondering, even as we were doing so much of this work, saying, so why are we building this and not that? Why do we build this space and not 10 other things that we know should be done? And at the same time, here we've been going through these oil crisis and energy crisis, and we learned all about passive solar, but we couldn't convince anybody to do it. So why can't we convince people about sustainable design? What is wrong? I started thinking, well, I need to know more, so sold my company, and that's how I landed this gig as an urban futurist. I even had to kind of invent the name. So the fact is that when you're looking for credibility, I guess urban futurist wouldn't be the best choice, but nevertheless, it was the right thing for me, because what you do as a futurist is you learn to think longer, and you learn to think wider, and you learn to think more deeply about the things that we're trying to address. Which brings me to the first fallacy. Tomorrow is just like today, only more. We call this in future studies, we call it the baseline forecast. It's just today and you just multiply it out. And it's the way that growth has been seen, but it's not really the way that things happen. There's all kinds of things that you would not predict, but that have happened. But they happen so suddenly. 9/11 is a perfect example. Katrina in New Orleans is another. Had very huge urban consequences, but you didn't really predict them happening until you start tracking back. Well, you might think that architects and engineers are already futurists, they're already thinking ahead, but the fact is what we have to do is think all about the project right in front of us. We have very intense short-termism. It's all about the next deadline. A lot of fields have this. And it's one of the benefits of thinking about the future, is that you think ahead so that you can know more about the decisions you're making today. The thing is that it's not only short-termism, it's that everything we know is based on the past, but everything that we're designing and building is all about the future. It's all in the future. In fact, every decision you're making is always about the future. But how many of you ever had a class about forecasting? How many ever had a class about strategic planning forward? It's a whole different way of thinking. Well, sometimes there's a thing said that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. William Gibson invented that idea, and so I look for places that you can find the future today. And sometimes you can find it just like right under your nose, maybe it's the grandma using an iPod or an iPad or some sort of course I'm a grandma, so I don't want to say too much about that. But it's things that don't seem, the paradoxes that you see of time warps like that, or sometimes it's halfway around the world. And so I was recently in Rio doing a project for UNESCO, Futures Literacy Project, and got the chance to go through one of the favelas. In the foreground you see market housing, in the background you see a favela. These are large-scale slums. Like 3 million people in Rio live in these slums, and over 1 billion people in the world live in slums in the global south. They're these informal developments. Sometimes they're much uglier than the one I just showed you. Sometimes they look like this, and they look totally unsanitary, and yet here they are in the modern world, over 1 billion people living like this, and by 2050, it's predicted there'll be another 2 billion people that live in slums. It's just unbelievable. So in those cases, we have more people than we do city, right? I mean, there was more people wanted to live in Rio than there was anywhere for them to live. In this case, in China, they build faster than people can be moved into the cities. Right now, they say they have 64 million empty apartments or units, dwelling units, 64 million. In the United States, there's only like 119 million total. So it'd be like if half the housing in the US was empty. It's not that they don't have the people, it's that they haven't moved them yet. They haven't moved them because there aren't jobs yet, so they build these whole cities that look like this. Empty neighborhoods can sit there for 5 years before they get moved in, because it can only move about 17 million people a year into the cities, and they can build a lot faster than that. So they have more city than people. It creates this urban gap. Now we have it too, right? Detroit. The people have left, the city's still sitting there. Or sometimes you think you're balanced and the next day you're not, right? 30 minutes, 15,000 people made homeless. It happens so fast, like in a flash, you don't even know when it's going to happen to you. Well, the fact is, we have a huge global population growing. And it's only happened in the last 100 years or so. The first billion people in 1800, and now we have 7 billion in the next 200 years. Here we have a 12,000-year-old history, and most of the people have happened in the last 200 years. And now we're planning on, according to this, another 2 billion people in the next 40 years. All of them need to live somewhere, and you can see exactly where they're going to live. They're going to live in the global south. This is the developing countries, and they are just what happens is that there's an urbanization going on there that we've already done. There is hardly any new development in the developed countries like ours. But in fact, cities are really only about 100 years old. The weird thing is that they maybe have already peaked. Urbanization is already slowing. So what you look at here on the left, in fact, the most emergent part about this is down here, because this is the future. This is Europe and such, they're starting to shrink. Here's Nigeria still jumping up there, and here's the US going quite slowly, still growing. But over here after 2050, these two countries fall off the cliff. So 150 million people less in India in the next 80 years or so, and 300 to 450 million people less in China. In other words, the size of the United States in China, almost maybe more than 500 million people. What they're planning on doing, though, in China is in the next 20, 30 years, housing all of these people, 350 million people, that they won't even need the housing for 70 years from now. That it's shrinking already, and that they're building essentially the entire United States infrastructure that they won't even need in 50 or 60 years. Don't you think you would start building differently if you were thinking in terms of such short-term construction? Because the things that we build now are very, very difficult to destroy. As you can see from Detroit, they have 80,000 empty houses there, and 12,000 fires a year, but it doesn't take care of all the tattoo on the land, right? There's still all the streets. In other words, our cities have to be adaptive. Our cities have to be more adaptive and flexible, and as opposed to becoming obsolete. Or they have to be beloved, such as Rome. The Pantheon is something that people will never want to tear down. It's 2,000 years old already. No wonder we can't tear it down. They have to be a beloved sort of place. And a lot of cities, most cities have some places that will never be torn down. Oops. Or they get forgotten. That's the third kind of city. And those cities are going to multiply. Because we build these really bland suburbs, or we build these bland segments of the city, and when people vacate them, it's over. They just sit there. And then you have to figure out what to do with them. Why aren't they biodegradable cities? Why aren't they movable cities? Because what's happened is that the population has moved kind of with the sun. So there was a big growth in Europe, then there was a big growth here, then a big growth in China and Asia and India, and now a big growth is coming up in Africa and the Middle East. And then what happens, as soon as they move into cities, then they don't need as many, then girls start getting educated. They don't need as many kids in the family because they aren't farming. Fertility starts going down. Urbanization, the population peaks and urbanization peaks right after that. But in the meantime, you're trying to fill this gap between how many people and how much city. And the cities are really hard to change. So fallacy number 2, you may think that somebody's watching over the whole city. But the fact is, this is the part about being wider. The other is about being longer term. This is about being wider, thinking in systems, thinking in terms of who's watching over things. Well, we're disciplined, I do the architecture, someone else does the storm sewers, and someone else is doing the highways, and then you think, well, the planners put it all together. Well, yes, but they're dealing with one municipality, and there may be, I don't know how many there are in Salt Lake City, but there may be 100 different little municipalities within the metro area, and nobody watches all of that. Because there is no mayor of the metro, right? There isn't any such thing. And so the city just kind of does its own thing, and they compete with each other. And then they build useless things, and then later on you have to figure out what to do with them. Well, so what happens is that the designers, the planners, we're in the closed system world. This is the industrialized thinking where you always carve out your parcel, carve out your expertise. And that's because we want to control certainty and also because we're dealing with specific projects. The futurists, on the other hand, use a system thinking that's open. Things are blurred. You have to think as many consequences and what-ifs as possible. That's the idea of thinking about possibilities. But when you think that way, the main issue that comes up is uncertainty. I used to think that futures were all about change, but it's really about uncertainty. And that's because with uncertainty is the only area that you ever get novelty and innovation. Because if you're really sure about what you're doing, nobody's going to do it any differently, right? You just keep doing what you're doing. Hey, this works. You have to have something broken in order to fix it. Well, so from that comes transformation. And what we really want to do is transformational futures. So there's such things as technology change. And with each one of these technological changes, then you get a big surge. You get a big, basically a collapse. And we just suffered that in 2008. So people say that now we may actually end up with what might be something of a golden age. And this is what you get when you start thinking in terms of the variety of domains, of the economic cycles, and mixing those along with the projects that we're doing in the city. So fallacy number 3 is cities are about things and not people. Well, really, why aren't cities about people and then we build the cities to that? The further out you look, the more variety you get, and the way that we create these scenarios is that we overlap the things that are longer, that are wider, and that are deeper. But if you're thinking about things that are deeper, then it's really the stories, the identity, the culture, who we are, and what matters to us. So here's a story about a walkability. Have any of you been to Seaside, Florida? It's along the coast. It's an 80-acre little town that was built in the early 80s as an experiment about walkability. Well, now I bet some of you even know the walk score of your neighborhood. It's about how close can you get to things, services and such, without getting in your car. Some people select their houses based on how walkable they are. This has taken about 30 or 40 years to even get into the normal lexicon of real estate. On the other hand, in Shanghai, you can build a city really fast. So this is a city that didn't get built that fast, but it got built in about 20 years. This is how much construction that's happened since 1990 in Shanghai. So what I want to look at is how this variety happens then in cities. Is because if we all live like Paris, then the entire 7 billion people could end up living in just 3 little states. And if we all live like New York, everybody could live in Texas. If there was 7 billion people and we lived like New York and Manhattan, we could all live in Texas. But if we all live like Texas, it would take up most of the lower U.S. It takes up about 24 states, and you can see about 2/3 of them. But look at the difference between these. So Paris looks like this, of course, the most walkable place. New York is this high, intense commerce. And then Houston, of course, has got these huge highways. I think that each one of these ways of living makes us be different people. I think each one of these cities attracts different people. And I think that that then is one of the things that we have to start thinking about as we're designing cities. Because the fact is that we're really not designing for us, but for them. And for them. And for her. To design great cities, we have to think about how we're connected. We have to think about future generations. We have to think in terms of systems that are open as well as closed, because it's important to know the particulars, the technology, but it's also important to think about where the context is, because everything that we're building has repercussions in the future. And the only way that we can know what to do about that is if we start thinking both long and deep and wide. Thank you.